So you've got your beats to work on, but what about fills? If you don't know what a drum fill is, it's that cool sounding thing that usually serves as a transition between parts of a song. Goon, ga, goon, ga, ba ga ga goo 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 goo, ba ga goo goo, boom. That is a fill. Fills can be made up of any kind of note, but all of the fills we're going to do in this video will be 16th note fills. But before we learn them, we have to learn how to read them, so let's go over that. Up until now, the only drums we've dealt with are the snare drum, which is the filled-in circle on the second space from the top, and the bass drum, which is the filled-in circle on the bottom space. For our fills, we're going to add the rack tom, which will be a filled-in circle on the top space, and the floor tom, which will be a filled-in circle on the second space from the bottom. If you have a second rack tom, we will not be using that drum at all in this, but if you're curious about what that would look like on the music, it would be a filled-in circle with the second line from the top going through it, in between the first rack tom and snare spaces. The purpose of this sheet is to teach you some cool fills, but also to get you used to reading the different drum notation. You are going to get confused and you will probably make mistakes because every single one of these drums is represented as a filled-in circle and they're only separated by a few lines or spaces. It's very easy to mix them up. The more you look at them and practice them though, the easier it gets. The last thing to know before we get into these is that you will always be alternating your hands to play these, starting with your right hand. If you start with your left hand, at some point you are going to get crossed up when you try to go to the floor tom. So even if you've been playing the hi-hat with your left hand, for these you will be starting with your right. After you play with the right, you are going to play with the left, and then after you play with that left, you are going to play with the right again. Neither of your hands will ever play consecutive hits on this sheet. You will always be alternating. Let's take a look at line 1. Line 1 starts out relatively easy. The first 4 notes are all in the snare, and the second group of 4 are up on the top space, which means they are rack toms. The second half gets a little denser, but if you look closely, it makes sense. The first 2 notes in the third group are snare drums. The next 2 notes in that group are rack toms again. The first 2 notes in the fourth group go back to the snare, and the last 2 notes are on the second space from the bottom, which makes them floor toms. With the beats, I had you looping them continuously. You do not need to do that with the fills. Obviously, repetition will be important to learn them, but you can stop and reset after each fill instead of going straight back to the beginning. Remember, always start with your right hand. Line 1 sounds like this. Faster, it will sound like this. Moving on to line 2, take a look at the very first drum. What is it? If you said floor tom, you would be correct, but from my experience teaching these, I'm guessing a lot of you said snare drum. That drum is on the second line from the bottom, so it is a floor tom. The next 3 hits in that group, plus the first 2 hits of the second group are on the snare, but that first one is a floor tom. After those snares in the first half of the second group, we're going to go up to the rack tom for 2 hits before coming back to the snare for all of the third group, and then going to the floor tom for all of the last group. It sounds like this. A little faster, it sounds like this. Looking through line 3, you should notice that we're only going to be playing 2 drums in the entire fill. The rack tom and the snare drum. Realizing this before you begin should simplify things. Now we just have to figure out the pattern. Group 1 starts with 2 hits on the rack tom and then goes down to the snare for 2 hits. Group 2 does the opposite of that, staying on the snare for 2 hits before going back up to the rack tom for 2 hits. All of Group 3 is played on the snare, and then Group 4 is the same as Group 1, with 2 hits on the rack tom and then 2 hits on the snare drum. It goes like this.
3 E and O, 4 E and O. 3 E and O, 4 E and O.
Faster, it goes like this. Line 4 is similar to line 3 in that we're only using 2 drums. But which drums? Take a look. If you said snare and floor tom, you are correct. Line 4 starts out with 4 snares for Group 1, 4 floor toms for Group 2, another floor tom for the beginning of Group 3, followed by 3 snares, and then Group 4 ends with 2 snares followed by 2 floor toms.
3 E and O, 4 E and O. 3 E and O, 4 E and O. Three E and O, 4 E and O. Three E and O, 4 E and O.
And faster.
3 and O, 4 E and O. 3 and O, 4 E and O. 3 and O, 4 E and O.
With line 5, we start out on the snare, go to the rack tom, down to the floor tom, back to the rack tom, back to the snare, back to the rack tom, and end on the floor tom. We're playing a half circle going to the right, then a half circle going back to the left, and then one more half circle back to the right. We start with 2 hits on the snare, go up to 2 hits on the rack tom, and then go down to 3 hits on the floor tom for Group 2, which is going to be right, left, right. The last hit of Group 2 is a rack tom with your left hand. That left hand leads into 2 more rack toms to start Group 3, followed by 2 snares to end Group 3, and then Group 4 is 2 rack toms and then 2 floor toms. Check it out.
3 E and O, 4 E and O. 3 E and O, 4 E and O.
Faster, it sounds like this. I'm going to be honest with you, I think line 6 is the hardest one. It's also really cool though, so the trade-off is worth it. Everything until the last 2 hits is between the rack tom and snare drum, so you'd think that wouldn't be too difficult. However, the snare gets played every 3 notes, which makes keeping track of your right and left hand a little confusing. The best way to learn this one is to play each group on its own, get comfortable with what it feels like, and then put them together. Group 1 is snare, tom, tom, snare. Group 2 is tom, tom, snare, tom. Group 3 is tom, snare, tom, tom. And then group 4 ends with snare, tom, floor tom, floor tom. Once you're comfortable with all 4 of those separately, you can start putting them together, which will eventually sound like this.
3 E and a, 4 E and a. 3 E and a, 4 E and a.
Sped up, it will sound like this. Okay, line 7 is adding the bass drum, which means that you need to pay very close attention to the drum that you're supposed to be hitting because they're all on the page now. And like I said, they all look pretty similar. When the bass drum comes in, it is going to be replacing whichever hand would have played. Group 1 is 4 snare drums, Group 2 is 4 rack toms, and then Group 3 is 1 of each drum: snare, rack tom, floor tom, bass drum. Right hand, left hand, right hand. Would have been a left hand, but now it's your foot. Since that would have been a left hand, the next hit to start group 4 is going to be a right hand, which will be played on the snare along with the rest of the hits in that group. It sounds like this.
3 E and a, 4 E and a.
Sped up, it sounds like this. Now line 8 takes the pattern that we played for group 3 in line 7, right, left, right, foot, and orchestrates it in a way that most people miss the first time, but once you see it, playing through line 8 becomes a lot easier. Group 1 is snare, rack tom, floor tom, bass drum. Group 2 is floor tom, rack tom, snare, bass drum. Group 3 is snare, rack tom, floor tom, bass drum, and group 4 is floor tom, rack tom, snare, snare. The drum your right hand ends on is the same drum your right hand starts on for the next group. Snare, rack, floor, bass. My right hand ended on the floor tom, which means I will start there for group 2. Floor, rack, snare, bass. My right hand ended on the snare, which means I will start there for group 3. Snare, rack, floor, bass. My right hand ended on the floor tom, which means I will start there for group 4. Floor, rack, snare, snare. My left hand doesn't even leave the rack tom until the very last hit. Line 8 goes like this.
3 E and a 4 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a Three E and a 4 E and a Three E and a 4 E and a
Faster, it goes like this. The last lines introduce 2 bass drums in a row. Line 9 starts out with 2 snares and then 2 bass drums. Group 2 repeats that. Group 3 moves up to the rack tom for 2 hits and is then followed by 2 bass drums. And group 4 moves down to the floor tom for all 4 hits. Right, left, would have been a right, would have been a left. Right, left, would have been a right, would have been a left. Right, left, would have been a right, would have been a left. And then right, left, left.
3 E and a 4 E and a 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 3 E and a 4 E and a
Last but not least, we have line 10. Group 1 is 2 snares and then 2 rack toms. Group 2 is 2 bass drums followed by 2 rack toms. Group 3 is 2 floor toms followed by 2 bass drums. And group 4 brings us back to the snare for all 4 hits. When you think about the orchestration in terms of each group, the last 2 hits of group 2 and the first 2 hits of group 3 can sometimes feel disconnected. Think about each group of bass drums separating each group of 4 hits. Those rack toms at the end of group 2 should flow right into the floor toms at the start of group 3.
3 E and a 4 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a
As you get more comfortable with these, and as you improve with all of the beats we've covered, you can start to combine the beats with the fills. To give you an example, I'll play one measure of line 1 from the mixed 8/16th note beats, followed by one measure of line 1 from the 16th note fills. I'm going to play a crash cymbal instead of a hi-hat for the first hit of the beat so that the fill resolves in a more satisfying way. Another way to practice these is to play 3 measures of a beat followed by 1 measure of a fill. I'll demonstrate that with line 6 of the mixed 8/16th note beats and line 8 of the 16th note fills. Mix and match the beats with the fills any way you want to, they will all work with each other. Now when you get to this point, the big thing you're going to want to focus on is playing the beat and the fill at the same speed. There's a very good chance that you're going to want to speed up when you get to the fill, so make sure that your 16th note counts are loud, clear, and at a consistent speed. All right, our first lesson is almost done. There's just one more thing I want to show you. See you in the next video.